Good afternoon, dear guests. My name is Svanhildur Konráðsdóttir. I'm a director at the city of Reykjavik. Thank you for showing the interest and the stamina to stay until the second panel. And the headline for this second panel today, Can Cities and Citizens Change the World? And for a city such as Reykjavik, just having launched have the Peace Center with the University of Iceland this morning, this has to be the key question. Can we really change the world? And if the answer is no, then what can we change? And how can we encourage those agents of change that make all the difference? We've heard some of the speakers today and the previous panelists discuss and address many of the core issues or definitions of peace and power, ways of resetting the compass, and of how to put human values at the forefront of decision-making or storytelling. But here to explore the role cities and citizens have to play in this context, I've got 5 fantastic panelists. And just to keep you at the edge of your seats, I'm going to introduce them before they actually enter the stage. First, I want to introduce Dagur Eggertsson. He is the mayor of Reykjavik since June 2014. Before that, a city councillor since 2002, and the chairman of the City Executive Council for 4 years, 2010 to 2014. So, you can imagine, he has given a lot of thought to the roles of cities and how Reykjavik can achieve its fullest potential in the context of championing human rights and advocating peace. He is also a medical doctor and has an MA degree in human rights and international law from the University of Lund in Sweden. Melanie Greenberg is the president and CEO of the Alliance for Peacebuilding. In her international conflict resolution, in her work on international conflict resolution, Melanie has helped design and facilitate public peace processes in the Middle East, Northern Ireland, and the Caucasus. She is currently an adjunct faculty member at the Elliott School of George Washington University. Melanie is a frequent writer, lecturer, teacher, and trainer in a broad range of areas related to international law, international security, and peace building. She is a member of the International Advisory Board of the United States Institute of Peace and is on the board of the Institute of World Affairs. Sigríður Björk Guðjónsdóttir, Reykjavik Chief of Police since 2014, the first woman to hold that post. Previously, she was the head of police in Suðurnes and the Deputy Chief of State Police. Sigríður has been dedicated to implementing new procedures and has initiated fruitful collaborations when it comes to dealing with domestic violence. Her objective is to increase the safety of citizens in their homes, offer the victims and perpetrators better services, and improve the situation of children exposed to domestic violence. Þórunn Ólafsdóttir is a human rights activist and the founder of Akkeri, a humanitarian organization, whose mission is to promote continued relief for refugees by using the knowledge and experience of those who have worked with refugees as volunteers. Þórunn went to Lesbos to work as a volunteer in Idomeni refugee camps and has since been fighting for refugee rights. She received the City of Reykjavik Human Rights Prize in 2015 for her outstanding contribution in the field. And the last but not least of our panelists today is Dr. Micheli Akuto, who is the director of the City Leadership Laboratory at the University College London. At UCL, he is a professor of diplomacy and urban theory in the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Public Policy, where he also serves as research director. Michele is a senior fellow of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and a fellow of the Program for the Future of Cities at the University of Oxford. His forthcoming book, Are Cities the New Global Leaders?, will surely be highly interesting to all of us here, but he has written several books on the subject of cities. And I would like to start this session by inviting Dr. Acuto to come here to the stage and put us all on the same page, as it were, by giving an introduction to the topics the panel will then explore further. Please.
put us all on the same page. That's going to be a challenging one. But thanks a million for the invite and for the chance to have a look at the center, have a look at the opening of the center. It looks really terrific. And I think a couple of things that I'll show you hopefully point out the importance of something like the center that you're putting together. I'll try and do my homework by putting us all together on the city side and show you how it relates to citizens and groups of the community. Now, what I wanted to show you very quickly is a bit of work that we're doing, and that's the right-hand side. That's where we sit in London at the City Leadership Laboratory. And for the ones of you that don't know what it is, it's a joint effort of UCL, the World Bank, and UN Habitat. And effectively, we look at urban experimentation, innovation, and urban policy. But where I wanted to put the emphasis is on the right-hand side of the slide. Now, that's 458 mayors gathered last December on the side of the Paris Climate Conference. Now, that's one of the main instantiations that's effectively representing the C40 Climate Leadership Group. You might or not spot Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, or Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York and former chair of C40. But it also gathers things like the UCLG network of local governments, which is one of the largest ones in the world, or ICLEI, local governments for sustainability. Now, a bit of a mouthful, but to say, they gathered in Paris effectively to celebrate 10 years of campaigning, at least 10 years of campaigning and doing things for climate change. And that's where I wanted to put the emphasis. On the idea that city diplomacy and cities in general isn't just a question of whether they can change the world, but rather the cities are changing the world. And the real question that is to be asked is how are they doing it, and what are the implications of all of that. And one number at hand, for instance, looking at that gathering of mayors, was that in the 10 years of the effort of the C40 group, there has been about 8,000 climate action taken by cities jointly in the group, which many would argue is probably more than the 1.5 that brought us from the Kyoto Agreement to the Paris Agreement. Now, that's a skeptical view, and let's go on. But I'm a big fan of numbers, so I'll just show you a few slides of bits of research that we've been doing in the lab. This is, for instance, from a research where we asked ourselves, is it unique that we see these gatherings of mayors? Are UCLG, ICLEI, and C40 unique? And the answer is absolutely not. Numbers at hand, there's at least 200 formal networks of cities globally, connecting cities formally, linking with each other in city to city or city to other institutions efforts. And the important thing in that is, and when you're looking at that, is sort of the growth in the number of city networks globally, is that it is a long-lived story. But as you hit the end of the Cold War, there's been a steep growth in the numbers of city networks globally. And equally, as you hit the 2000s, there's been a steep growth in the typologies of things that cities link on and discuss and connect and do joint projects on. So for instance, cities are increasingly focusing on climate change and sustainability, whilst effectively in the immediate post-Cold War and before then, governance was one of the major things that made cities get together and do things jointly. And equally, and this is out of a project that we just finished with the World Health Organization, it is important to understand that this type of organizations, these type of city-to-city collaborations, are going more and more international. That since 2001, to take sort of an arbitrary date in a sense, but the recent past, we've gone progressively connected internationally and across regions. These are things like the WHO Healthy Cities movement, which gathers hundreds and hundreds of cities across Europe and internationally in Latin America, in Africa and so forth. But these are also new initiatives that, for instance, connect cities on culture, connect cities on gender and so forth. And that's the crux of the matter. We tend to associate, those of us that maybe pay a bit more attention to what cities do for the world or internationally, we tend to get stuck on the first picture that I show you, on the limelight and the big scenes of environment and climate change, because networks like C40 have been so phenomenal in putting themselves on the global map. But in fact, once we look at what are these 200 or 200 plus city networks doing globally, they're doing a lot of stuff. It isn't just environment. Environment, in fact, is just 29% of city networks globally. There is an important percentage of city diplomacy activity, for instance, an 8% of a city diplomacy internationally focused on gender issues. There's an important percentage focused on poverty, which might be sidelined on the newspaper headlines, but it remains a critical activity of cities getting together. And equally, that these things are getting into the cities. So what you're looking at underneath sort of the top graph is the fact that cities are progressively thinking about strategic approaches to these sort of challenges. So for instance, virtually every city has a sustainability strategy, but now you've seen the steep rise, 76 to 74% of cities globally, for instance, have a smart city strategy to deal with innovation and IT. And a good number, in reality, of cities have safety and security strategies. This is not, and it's something I've recently written with a colleague from Oxford, Steve Rayner, this is not at all just a matter of mayors or their likes meeting and having big gala events. It is very much a matter of cities exchanging and doing things. So for instance, when you ask yourself, okay, what is all this city diplomacy activity globally producing? In fact, it is producing a lot of policies, joint policies. 38% of city networks globally produce joint policies. These are things like reducing congestion jointly between a city in Brazil, a city in Mexico, and a city in France. Equally, they're connecting with each other, so newsletters, blogs, sharing information about the things that matters to them and trying to find peers that have the same problems. And even more importantly, they're reporting. They're assessing themselves and they're putting out their numbers as to their performance globally. This is out of a study that we did last year, in fact, for that 458 mayors gathering. It's a study called Power in Climate Action that we did with the C40 Climate Leadership Group and ARP. And what we were trying to put on paper, data on paper, was demonstrating that there is a capacity by cities to do things. Again, it isn't just a matter of meeting as much as it is a matter of doing. And what you're looking at, in fact, actually makes no sense. It's a non-statistically relevant graph to an extent. It doesn't prove anything, and that's the important thing that it does. This is very academic until I explain it. But quite practically, what we basically did is plot cities for their level of power, how much capacity they have owning, for instance, their critical assets, capacity of setting their strategy, independence from other layers of government, and how much or how many things they were doing. This is, for instance, on climate change, and things are policies and initiatives and pilots and so forth. And what the graph is telling you, by not telling you anything, is there is in fact no correlation between power of a city and number of things that cities do. This is probably a better way to put it. Same report, and that's why we decided to put a better graph next to it. If we divide the type of governance the cities have globally, and this again modeled on the C40 group, it is in fact cities that are collaborating, so cities that are perhaps less in charge of their own assets, of their own planning, but much more connected to the private sector, to other cities, to community groups, and so forth. Those are the cities that, in fact, the top of the graph, are the ones that are having the largest number of actions, the largest number of things that they do. But the more important part of that graph is the very light shaded blue, which basically represent the number of actions that have gone from pilot, a trial in a street, changing a few light bulbs, changing a traffic light, to a citywide initiative. And what all of this looking at cities globally told us was that, in fact, in that, the commanding types, the implementing types, the I'll do it myself type with lots of power, are far less likely to scale up the things that they do globally. And it is the cities that collaborate that actually scale up their activities, scale up their actions, and scale up their potential. Now, all of that, good news, hence we see change, we see capacity of cities to make a difference. But there's a few pieces of perhaps not bad news, but concerns when you think about the power of cities to change the world. So I just wanted to flag those very quickly. This I'm borrowing from my colleague at the lab, Jean-Paul Addy. He's been looking effectively at the impact and the connections between the universities and cities. So what you're looking at is a map of Greater London and the number of universities that there are around and in London. Why am I showing you this? Not just to show that there's a lot of universities in London, but there's an important number that if you have to go away and remember a number that I gave you, I'd suggest that one. 4 kilometers is the average distance between City Hall, the mayor, and the closest university. This is not just in London, this is not just in the C40 climate leadership group of the big cities. It's a number that we can get out of about 150 cities globally, so big, small, medium, mixed up. It takes only 4 kilometers to reach a pool of expertise that you can mobilize in the city. Why am I showing you this? There's all of that collaboration might be pointing at the idea that you have to cross the Atlantic and partner with New York to deliver things, or that you might need the private sector and consultancies to always deliver innovation. And one of the tricks that we always miss, and we've seen very little of, is in fact connecting, and that's why I was referring to the center here as being a brilliant idea, having the mayor and the president of the university and the president of the country all in the same room supporting the same thing. It doesn't happen that often. Very often we see cities relying on overseas knowledge and overseas innovation rather than the one that's just down the road. And equally, and this is Jean-Paul's plotting of that, universities themselves tend to have a limited orientation towards their own city and their own community, tend to be highly focused on knowledge exchange, highly focused on external relations, alumni and recruiting and international partnerships, and very little focus on their own community, on the things that are happening just down the road. So if you and that's just central London, within the space of about 20 or 30 meters, you'll find 3 or 4 large global universities. There, we might be missing a trick. Somewhere else where we might be missing a trick, and just very quickly, and this is sort of a project of the World Bank, it's the Public-Private Investment in Infrastructure project. We might be missing the fact that underneath all of this connectedness between cities, there's a massive amount of connectedness of real physical infrastructure. The map at the top, which is out of Harvard, is the map of the aggregate maritime and rail and international flight connectivity. Stuff is being put on the ground, and it tends to be put on the ground in a connected sense by the private sector much more than the public sector. Now that's all well-meaning, but if you look at the fourth company from the right in the graph, those are the largest investments above $1 million, or the largest companies by investment in infrastructure above $1 billion, sorry. You find a company, for instance, called Veolia Environment. Veolia is one of the largest global providers of things like waste management. And if you think waste management is trivial, waste management accounts for $433 billion a year, and it moves about 1.5 billion tons of stuff a year. Now, why would that matter for cities and the connections of cities? Is that in reality, most of the diplomacy of those connections doesn't happen at the state level, doesn't happen at the multilateral level. It happens down at the street level. That the most common city diplomacy activity is probably an environmental or a municipal waste management officer dealing with a company like Veolia or Siemens on a retrofit of your traffic lights. And that's how, in reality, most of city diplomacy happens. Not out there, not at the big summits, not in the big connections and flashy things, but on an everyday basis on the street. And last but not least, that again, on the back of all this physical and private connections, on the back of all the city diplomacy, really this year, hopefully some of you noticed, hopefully some of you will notice more, is really the year of the city. Just in a week's time, we're shipping off, possibly 30,000 of us are shipping off to a place called Quito in Ecuador, where the new urban agenda of the United Nations is set to be launched. It is the document that the United Nations set out to sort of explain effectively what to do with the urban age, what to do with the fact that there are 4 billion people currently living in cities, and it's projected to rise. Now, this happens after the Paris Agreement on climate change, after the Sustainable Development Goals, after the Hyogo framework, the Sendai framework on disaster risk reductions, all of which put a whole lot of emphasis on the importance of cities. Problem, all of which marginally involved cities. The cities, in fact, cities meaning mayors and local authority, have a marginal presence or have had a marginal presence in all of this. So, for instance, mayors are never mentioned in the UN New Urban Agenda, paradoxically. Or they were consulted for the SDG, Sustainable Development Goal 11, about cities. So city diplomacy, critical but fundamental there, and fundamental to remember those things. The power of the private sector in connecting, the importance of states setting the big agendas still, not necessarily cities themselves, which take a back seat. And I wanted to leave you one last slide. We do, in fact, teach a course called Change the World at UCL, where we put more than those 458 mayors in the room. We put about 700 engineering students in a room, in a couple of rooms, because they don't all fit in the same room, for 2 weeks. And we ask them to tackle a real-world problem, a real-world challenge. Now, this year, we asked them to sort of look at issues of safety and security, and we asked them to tell us, okay, what is a critical issue for city diplomacy? So we were working with things like the mayor of Palermo and the mayor of Santiago and the UN Technical Working Group on Safer Cities. Now, hundreds of students told us one thing in particular. They're really good at giving us one number. And the number was very simple, and that's in reality I cheated. There's 2 numbers to remember. 4 kilometers is the closest university. And in London, at the moment, students told us a massive problem for city diplomacy is that there are 7,581 people living without a house, homeless. And this has been growing exponentially, and globally, there's at least, probably more than 100 million people that are living homeless. Now, what does that have to do with city diplomacy more in general and the power of cities to change the world? Is that when we think about mayors and city leaders as diplomats, we must think about the fact that they're representing their cities. They're representing their citizenry. They're representing urban dwellers. So when you put actual academic and university and community students thinking behind all of this, not just the big agendas of the United Nations or of the Sustainable Development Goals, one critical thing that pops up is the people that live in cities are the critical one. The meter as to whether cities are changing the world and how well they're doing it is really how much are they doing for their own city dwellers and citizens. And those are sort of the numbers to remember. And I suppose I'll leave it at that. Hopefully it's done a bit on citizens, but hopefully that was on cities to start with.
Thank you very much, Michele. This was really inspiring. Can I now invite our panelists to come and join us here on stage? There were some very strong key words that you mentioned, I think, in your presentation, collaboration, I think, being one of them. I think now we've got about 40 minutes, I believe, to explore the topics further. And I would like to invite the other panelists to make a short comment, 3 to 5 minutes, I believe we have, either to address some of the issues or any of the issues that were raised here earlier, or I would also perhaps allow myself to encourage you to reflect on the issue of the day and the days ahead, meaning peace and human rights, things that are totally linked. So I think I might begin at the other end. Melanie, how do you feel about that?
Good. Thank you very much. Well, I can't tell you what an honor it is to be here in Reykjavik. And I have an inexplicable sense, I've been here now 3 times, of coming home when I come here. And it's not only because my clothes seem to match the flower arrangements so well, but I think it's because living in a very violent city, I'm from Washington, D.C., coming to Reykjavik feels like I'm coming to a city where you are living the values of peace in your community and your outward focus in the world that I hold so dear and that I devote my life to. So I want to congratulate the new center and look forward to collaboration and partnership, and hope that you will look not only to very high-level diplomacy, but also, as we're discussing today, looking at the power of citizens to make peace, and to make Reykjavik an oasis for citizen peace builders to come to gain energy and to help solve the problems of the world. Just a few reflections on the role of citizens in peace. So another reason that Reykjavik is so precious to me is that I was a senior in college and university when the Reykjavik summit occurred. And for someone who'd grown up in the shadow of the Cold War, where there every day you really felt the very imminent presence of nuclear Armageddon, to see world leaders come together and discuss the possibility of doing away with nuclear weapons felt like just a chink in the armor of the Cold War. We couldn't understand then that the Cold War would end within 5 years, but we did start to see the power that these leaders had for peace. And I think one of the things that's changed the most since the original Reykjavik is the power of citizens to make peace. During the Cold War, there was a sense that, well, citizens couldn't be mucking around in peace because the stakes were too high. You know, everything could lead to nuclear war. But then once the wall fell, there was a sense that, in fact, you couldn't have peace without citizens, that peace had to be both a top-down and a bottom-up effort. And as we look around the world's cities, I'm afraid that often cities have become kind of code names for violence. You think about, in my country, Ferguson, Baltimore, San Bernardino, internationally, Paris, Nice, Ankara, as places of war, terrorism, Aleppo. What we don't hear about quite as often is what citizens are doing in all of these cities to create peace. And in some ways, it's because cities with so many people in such close proximity are areas of great creativity, they're laboratories, and ways that actually citizens and governments can work very closely together. I think Michele's chart showing that more collaborative and facilitative governments lead to more transformational peace is actually something we see throughout the peace-building field as a hallmark of good governance. But I'll just give you a couple of very short examples, and we'll be happy to expand during the question and answer. In Baltimore, which is very close to where I live, local church leaders, academics from Johns Hopkins, youth leaders, and the peace-building community are coming together to do joint conflict analyses, to really try to map together what are the real drivers of violence in Baltimore, and how can we work more collaboratively to reduce the level of gun violence. And it's a very complex system. In Harrisonburg, a very small city in Virginia, the police are working with local citizens on negotiating new ways of thinking about human security in an area that's very racially divided and with great economic disparities. In Aleppo, even now, there are citizens who are working on local citizen ceasefires that well below the radar on individual streets. They're working on truces between rebel and government forces. It's very hard work. Many have had to leave the country, but even in this most dire situation, peace is happening. So I urge all of us to really think about the power of citizens, the creativity that we bring in the overall picture of peace. And I look forward to being a partner with the Reykjavik Peace Center and all of your work going forward.
Thank you very much, Melanie. Þórunn.
I want to start with a question. How many of you know how to perform a heart surgery? Can I see hands?
I've seen it.
We have one. We have one.
How many of you know first aid? Exactly. What I've been doing the last year is basically first aid in the biggest meaning of those words. And the reason why most of us know first aid is because it's a responsible act. It's a responsible act in a society to have the knowledge to save a life when needed. And even though we don't all know how to perform a heart surgery, we could keep a person alive until help arrives. And this is what people like me have been doing the last year. And I'm here today as a citizen, and I didn't even grow up in a city. I grew up in a town of 700. But I've seen what people can do when they just decide to do it. And I think we all have that responsibility towards each other to help out when help is needed. And I have a lot of people coming to me and asking me questions about my work, but most of them share one thing. They come to me and say, I wish I could do something. We can all do something. There's nothing about wishing there. Not everyone might be able to go and work on the field. Not everyone is able to take a year off from work. Not everyone is able to leave their homes and families. But people know how to make soup and how to write articles, how to knit. There are endless pieces of work that needs to be put together so we can keep people safe in those areas where they are coming to escape. They are escaping war, they are fleeing their homes. But when they arrive in Europe, many of them said, we didn't expect to find another war here. So even though dealing with the refugee situation in Europe might be considered as it might be considered as an answer to war, like they are here, they are safe, but they are not. And in my mind, peace is safety. It's not feeling threatened by other people, and not doing anything and only sitting at home and wishing we could do something is a big threat to those who are fleeing war. There are so many things we can do, and we can all do something, but and if we don't feel like we can participate in any way, at least we should not add on to the problem. I met a man on Lesbos. He told me he walked 35,000 kilometers for peace. And I asked him, why? What has that to do with peace? It's peaceful to walk. I'm not doing any harm while I'm walking. And that's basically it. If you don't feel like you can help or do anything to better the situation, try to remain peaceful.
Thank you, Þórunn. Dagur, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, we're both talking about citizens' role and then the city's role, and I just wanted to comment shortly. I think the kind of discussion on cities and what they are for and what they can do is just beginning in a sense. In my opinion, the future lies in cities, and that kind of a game of words, but expresses the reality that now over 50% of humankind live in cities, and within a few decades, that number will be 75% of humankind, and before the end of this century, it's predicted it will be around 90%. And found the comment very interesting that cities have, to some extent, been a code name for violence, and I think you're right. And I think in many countries, and certainly in Iceland, I mean, to move to the city was something negative. Cities were the slums and the mud and connected with poor living conditions, although in reality people were fleeing bad living conditions to the cities in search of better life. And so I think that we should focus on cities as kind of places where solutions are made, and we could, of course, talk about violence. For example, violence against women. We can talk about war, but also climate change and housing. And I think that, at least in some analyses, it's very interesting to think if climate change and wars are really so different. And some of the connections come through water, or the access to water. And I think coming from a medical perspective, what matters most is to have a healthy population or a community is maybe three things. It's water, it's women's rights, and equality, equity, both economical and through justice and welfare. And I think that cities can contribute to peace through ensuring that justice and equality, water and human rights, especially women's rights, and through that I mean housing, etc. And that's kind of the broad picture, and I think that every mayor in the world really feels sort of responsibility for that, and the numbers you were showing I think express that mayors all over the world feel that they are dealing with the same problems all over the world, so they need to talk more together about those problems, because national governments are sometimes blind and sometimes ignorant about urban issues, urban problems and urban solutions. We, for example, live in a country where we have no urban vision on a national level. Kind of the only city in the country is more or less dealt with as a problem. It's pulling people from elsewhere, but not as a kind of great commodity for the future, to create a quality of life that can compete with other city areas in the world, which it actually is. I could also comment on the connection between cities and universities, and but let's leave it with this. I think that kind of the focus of cities is always on the citizens, both in small things and large things. So I think it's a very fruitful discussion to discuss peace within kind of a city framework.
Thank you, Dagur. Sigríður.
Yes, I would like to focus on these concepts: collaboration, peace, human rights, and from the viewpoint of the president, when he opened this fora today, he posed two questions. What can we do? What can I do? And we can do a lot. For the last 2 years, the focal points within the police here in Reykjavik Metropolitan Police have been battling human trafficking, putting that on the agenda, And 10 years ago, nobody wanted to listen to that, the concept that it could be human trafficking in Iceland. But by creating awareness and going to find the problems, find the cases, then everybody understands that this is a huge problem here, as everybody in every other place. And for example, collaboration in this respect is the unexpected ally that we got was the unions. They are tireless in communicating with the workers, and they are bringing the cases now. So they are helping a lot to make this a more peaceful and secure environment. And then there's the topic of gendered violence. It was mentioned that I'm the first female police commissioner here in Reykjavik, and I don't know if that's the perspective, if that has anything to do with it. Maybe it's just because I'm a mother and I have both a daughter and sons, and I can see that their points of view are different. But we have been focusing on the battle against violence in the home, domestic violence, both from the standpoint of the children, but also of the battered spouses. And by collaborating, by cooperating with the city officials, we are getting quite good results. The good results is that we put all the force in the investigation at the beginning of a case, when we come to a scene, before we went to the place, and then we wanted to follow up later. But then the circle violence had moved forward, and every door was closed. So we had to change, and it only happened because we joined forces and worked together with the welfare people and the child protection people, and also the incredibly important NGOs. So we are trying to go from almost 70% recurrent violence and trying to get that down, and hopefully by battling this full force on, we can change at least the security of people in their homes and make peace there. Also, we have invested in protecting children, runaway children, and that's also done by cooperation with the child welfare. And we have a person 24/7 that goes and finds the missing person, trying not to put the picture in the papers, because then there is a face and a name that the predators out there can abuse. So we try to find them and bring them back, and that has been a success from many days, average time up to maybe 3 hours, because we have so good connections now. We are focusing now on sexual crime, and we are doing it by increasing our expertise and changing our structure. And hopefully we will see many cases come to us, because we are not so worried about the cases that come to the police. We are more worried about those who do not. So we are trying to think of this as a service that we need to bring closer to the public. And that's why we are partly with the city and also with the Minister of Welfare putting up a center, one-stop shop for the sufferers of violence. And the idea was launched in March, when we were invited by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to go to the United Nations Women's Conference, where we had a side event on domestic violence, and then we went to see an organization for exactly this. This is what we are trying to copy. And that was in March. And we were always talking about how everybody knows everybody, and that can create problems. But it cannot only create problems, it also creates opportunities. The key players were there, and it has already happened in 6 months. So I think that's quite something, and it could not happen anywhere else but in Iceland. So that's my opinion.
Thank you so much, Sigríður.
Well, not quite done. I will try. I will be really short.
Couple of more points, then we have to move on.
Yes. Okay, just 2 more things. We are already putting a person on hate crimes, not when something has occurred, but before, to try and establish trust and communication on this. And we are trying to also fight for equality in the police, where we have 85% of the police officers are male, and mostly of the superiors are that as well. And I probably don't have time for all the other things I wanted to say. Maybe later. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
But they are great, I see.
But just one thing, because we can change the world, because the model of domestic violence that is being imported to Sweden, the Gothenburg region has already taken it up. The Polish people are looking at it, Greece, Lithuania, and UK. So we can have effect. Okay, now I stop, please.
Well, I think as we can all hear, our panelists are all very optimistic, if not firm believers, in the possibility and the power of cities to change the world, and from what I hear, also in the power of the individual to change the world. Even if it's just with first aid, but at least do no harm. So I would just invite you very briefly to, if there's anything you want to respond to or comment on before we just open up to questions from the audience. Any points you want to address from what the other panelists have mentioned?
Buckets, and yeah, I can barely do first aid, but yeah, I think one expression I think would be quite fitting. One of the crucial problems, let's say, or sticking points that made the negotiation on the UN new urban agenda so lengthy and in fact falling apart at some point in July, and hence needing one more round of negotiations just in September, where sort of we scrambled together something, was the expression right to the city, or the human right to the city. Now it's well developed and well tested in places like Latin America, but it effectively means the right of anyone that is an urban dweller to shape the urban environment that they live in. It's the fundamental right that you have not to just live in a city that is created for you, but to create your own city. Now, incredibly, or not, in fact, because we're talking human rights, that was the sticking point of national negotiations around the UN urban agenda. And the common comment that you would hear from the negotiators, and especially from the mayors around that issue, was that that was a national problem, not a city problem. And that cities, in fact, or local governments, understand very well that power of the community, that power of the creativity of the community to bubble up solutions, and the power of the resiliency of the community. So for instance, we just finished a piece of work on comparing very different contexts, that of Kathmandu and the earthquake in Kathmandu versus Sendai and the Great Eastern Earthquake, or as you might know it as Fukushima disaster. And the critical thing in both cases, no matter the level of development, is the level of informal networks that supported people in the first instance. So yes, definitely the guy that knows first aid, but also the person down the road that understands how to do a deed of trust or how to pay a traffic infringement that you simply don't know. So the fact that the community is a reservoir of expertise. And I think the idea of the right to the city has been a massive issue as national negotiations, but as city leaders, it's very well rooted in the importance of community as a source of innovation, resilience, creativity. So I thought that's worth adding. One thing that's worth adding, it's not just in your job. 84% of city, with respect, but 84% of city leaders globally are men. So there might be a reason why we're struggling on gender plans. Just throw a number in there, just in case.
So that's an idea for change then. Right,
Same.
Thank you so much. I think this has been very rich. I want to open now up the floor, the mic, here we go. And if I can ask you to, there's a first one here. Yep. Can I ask you just to stand up and briefly introduce yourself? If you are addressing a particular panelist, please make that sure. And we've only got like 15 minutes, so I would ask people to...
I'll be quick. As you know, I'm Annika from Lund. I was wondering about prosecution, if it's indeed the case that cases actually do get get to court. Because one of the problems in Sweden is that a lot of attention paid to these sorts of cases, but then in terms of prosecution, it quite often falls flat in court. And I had another question. Yes, Melanie. I wanted to ask a little bit more about Baltimore and the kind of gender-based aspects of these sort of conflict resolution efforts, because funnily enough, it's something we've been teaching on our gender course, me and a colleague, on conflict resolution using Baltimore, but I'm not very knowledgeable, so I was have to pretend I knew more than I did.
Okay, thank you. So I think the first one was addressed to Sigríður on the prosecution side.
Before we started this initiative, there were very few cases that went to court. And that was basically because there was, you had to press charges, and when we finally had finished our research, investigation, then the circle of violence had changed, and we couldn't get collaboration from the victims or witnesses. That has changed a lot. And also we had about 20 cases per month before this started. Now there are over 50. So a lot of things are happening. The prosecution is still not where I would want to see it, but we are increasing radically. So we are on the right way.
Great, thank you. Melanie, you want to comment on the gender issue?
Sure. So in Baltimore, you see very high levels of violence against women as part of the overall pathology. But you also see the traumatization of women who have to be witnesses in court cases, who are often the mothers of young men who've been shot. And in the conflict analysis that we did, that was actually very much a stream of the work of understanding not only the most kind of obvious external effects of violence against women, but also this very pervasive, corrosive, just feeling of disempowerment among women who often are leading households, are working jobs while trying to raise their children. So that was very much a part of the discussion.
Thank you. Did that answer your questions? Yep, looks like it. Anyone else?
Well, thank you, and thank you to all the panelists. I would like to ask, following up on Þórunn's comments about the refugees and the work that she's been doing. Now we see that the cities are taking bigger approach, playing a bigger role in things that have nationally been seen as states' affairs. I would like to ask Þórunn, maybe if she could comment a little bit on what's her vision now that we're talking about the refugee crisis or the situation of refugees. Do you think that cities can play and should play a bigger role? And then possibly, if someone else would like to comment on that, the role of cities in responding to the situation of refugees in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very urgent question. Þórunn.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Definitely, and we, all of us who have been involved in the refugee situation, we have been trying to encourage states to take more refugees in, but then we need the cities to welcome them and the citizens. And when I referred to the heart surgery in the first state earlier, was maybe to highlight the fact that we are not all specialists in how to handle this situation, this unique situation, but we all have something to give. We all have some kind of empathy, and we, at least the people in here, cares about their fellow citizens because they have practiced first aid. And if you don't care about other people, you don't do that. So, of course, cities and citizens are the key to, how can I say it, to opening their homes, their hearts, their societies to those people who are fleeing. So I would definitely say that they have a really, really big and important role in all of this.
Thank you. I think it might be very interesting to hear from Dagur on this question as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if we, well, first, most of the refugees are actually in the next countries of the But those that get to Europe, say, in the Syrian, they are coming to the cities. The national government control the borders and how many are let into the country, and we are not letting very many actually in, neither asylum seekers than refugees. And Reykjavik and some other municipalities are very much willing to take more responsibility and accept and service, if you like, both more asylum seekers and refugees. We are currently discussing this with the ministries, and what would Útlendingastofnun be?
Sigríður would know.
Immigration. And I actually think this goes for cities all over Europe as well. And it's very interesting because the flip coin of this is increasing hostility towards foreigners, refugees, asylum seekers in Europe. But the statistics are telling us that you get more opposition where you have the fewest numbers. So there's no direct link between having a lot of refugees or a lot of immigrants and hostility towards them. And this is something for universities to explain all over, and not for mayors.
Does anyone else want to comment? Yes, Melanie.
So one dilemma we face in the peacebuilding field is that refugee problems and crises are not seen enough in the public mind as peace crises. And one thing that we're seeing in American cities, which have very concentrated diaspora of refugees, Somalian refugees in Minneapolis, Ethiopian refugees in Washington, is the power of the diaspora to focus their own governments, primarily in Washington, on the peace problem. And we've seen some very good activation of how to reframe the whole refugee crisis in a way that gets national governments to focus on the root causes. And I think that's something that we in civil society need to support.
Okay, thank you. David.
I'm interested in peacefulness, not peacefulness from violence, but peacefulness in and of itself as an innate quality of human, and actually not only human, of the peacefulness of well-being of all that is. And I'm also very attracted to your idea of first aid, which I can't do. So what I would like to ask the panel is, what is the role in nurturing peacefulness in our lives, in and of itself?
Thank you. Now, who wants to tackle this one? Anyone volunteering?
I can say something.
Michele, yes, please.
As an academic, you can always say something. No, jokes aside, I think from a city's perspective, also from a local government perspective, I think a critical thing there, we've just experienced it in the UK, for instance, just on the cusp of the courteous exit of the country from the European Union. And one of the very first reactions of the current mayor, who has a strong agenda of inclusion and cosmopolitan connection across the city, was to launch what seems like a trivial campaign, but it was a campaign called London is Open, trying to point out how, in fact, London and many other cities in the UK had voted overwhelmingly in favor of staying in the European Union, and overwhelmingly there isn't the resentment that you would find in other places for against the foreigner, against the intrusion in sort of your everyday. And I think what's critical there is that it is at the city level and the collaboration with the community that you can nurture peacefulness versus sort of repatch together sort of bad feelings about the foreigner. And they seem trivial, things like the London is Open campaign, things like the Palermo Charter on migration, where the mayor is trying to set up permanent or temporary at least visas for migrants. Those things are fundamental, but they're really played at the intersection of the city standing between the community and having sort of positive peace in a sense, if we've stealing from Steve, a positive peace approach to the community whilst juggling the government. You still need to respond and relate back to government. And I think one major hindrance in creating that peacefulness sort of environment is when the local government or the mayor plays against the national government and tries to appease local communities versus sort of being conciliatory middle ground, if that makes any sense.
Melanie, you want to add to that?
One of the real revolutions now in the field of peace building is the understanding of neuroscience, and the hard wiring we have in our brain, both towards fear and a sense of exclusion of the other, but also empathy. Mm-hmm. And some of the most interesting work going now in the field is how to avoid the more fear-based anger responses in the brain. And I run a project now that links neuroscience, peace building, and spirituality. So it's looking at practices of mindfulness, religious practice, shamanistic healing, a whole range. But within that, what can we use to counter our hard wiring and to counter the trauma that's caused by violence so that we can be more peaceful and can then create more peace in our communities?
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question before we wrap up and get final comments from our panelists. Anyone bursting with something to know? Yep, yes, here we go.
Who was it?
Thank you. My name is Morten. I have a question for, I think, chiefly for Acuto. I wonder about the Habitat 3 conference and the new urban agenda. Can you, what kind of an impact do you think this document will have? And are there clear connections to peace in the document and the process that will follow?
Thank you. Michele.
In 20 seconds or less, it's the most debated issue at the moment. Will it make any difference, or are we just making a statement? For lots of us that have been quite involved, actually, we all think it does make a difference because it has raised the level of the discussion about the future of a planet that is almost fundamentally urban. It has raised that level of discussion. We are having discussions, for instance, on how to mainstream urban issues throughout all the Sustainable Development Goals. And those things then have tangible implications on the ground. Have tangible implications how, for instance, you conduct peace-building operations or crisis response operations if the places where crisis hits tend to be urban. Is it a watered-down document? Yes. Does it have a lot about rights, human rights, peace in general? No. Is there space for it? Yes, because that is a UN document, but there's an enormous reality around it of non-governmental activity, of city-based or city networking activity that is in fact doing exactly that. That is picking up where the document fails and does things. It's just a matter of recognizing and funding those sort of things, which is pretty fundamental. And you don't see enough, again, you don't see it in the news because you see the big UN discussion. But yeah, there is good hopes.
Right, okay. I just want to make one observation because it seems to me that like there's one word that keeps popping up in this discussion today, right from the beginning, when the president made his first speech, and that is the word empathy. I think almost like every single panelist or every single speaker has used that word to describe perhaps the key to, well, at least if we're talking about peacefulness, and I think the key to healthy and prosperous communities, societies. I would just, because I believe we have a few more minutes, Pia, you let me know. Yes, we have a few more minutes. I would just want to invite the panelists to comment on that. What is in your opinion, well, I wouldn't say the magic way, but the key to creating a community or a society or a city, if you like, that fosters and encourages and nourishes empathy? Anyone?
If
Dagur,
I
you
start,
want to-
well, to me, empathy is not just kind of a word or a concept. It's really about this basic thing, which is the most important thing you can learn early in life. And if you don't learn it early in life, then please learn it later. That's the key to almost everything in communication or being a parent or being a friend or being anything, is to try and think about it every day, to set yourself in the footsteps of others. And I think empathy comes out of that. So if we can ensure that people do that, we're in a better place. And I actually think that the way cities are set up, they can do a lot to encourage that, and they can work against it. That's a whole philosophy about how we create public space, how houses are aligned to the streets, if they are kind of closing off from the streets or opening up so neighbors meet each other. It's a much longer speech.
Okay. Thank you. We'll take it up later on then. Sigríður, do you want to comment?
Yes. Well, from the police point of view, we need to, and we are working on developing from being a power structure to a service-oriented structure. And we do that by using servant leadership. And that means that we are trying to look for leaders in our organization, and we have to build up a common vision. And the vision is the service, the aim of why we are here. This is not about us, this is about the people that we are servicing. And I think that most people go into the police because they have empathy, they want to help their fellow neighbors and fellow people. And I also think that it has been such a fast changing community just the last 10 years. It's so much more complicated. So I think that now we are in need of university education for police, where empathy, where the psychological approach and the respect for people of other origin, and that needs to be in the foreground.
Thank you. Þórunn, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think it's impossible to speak about peace and safety without using the word empathy. It's a key word in this discussion. And I think because we live in, like we all know and we've been talking about here, we live in a male-dominated world where it has often been criticized to use feelings when you should be rational. You should be talking about numbers, not feelings. And I think the more empathy we get into the system where the decisions are made, I think we will have a more peaceful world.
Okay, thank you. Michele, do you want to go next? And then Melanie will have the final say on the matter.
Wow, pressure there. I think I'd go with Dagur, absolutely. The empathy isn't just feeling for someone, but rather putting yourself in someone's shoes. A common number that got thrown around a lot again around the new urban agenda was 1.3 billion people live in slums. And if you say it like that, it seems like a problem. But in fact, if you put yourself in the shoes of someone that lives in slums, in fact, that 70 million people that every year go to cities, lots of them go to slums. Slums isn't a problem, it's just a condition. And putting yourself, what the negotiators of the urban agenda were doing, for instance, lots of them were putting themselves in the shoes of a person that lives in the slums, that might not need that slum to be cleared, might need access to services, and so forth. So I suppose that in that, empathy is about looking at things not just as problems, but as in the shoes of the people that live in those problems, which might turn out to be not problems.
And then better solutions.
Better solutions.
Exactly. Thank you. Melanie.
Well, I agree that empathy is the very DNA of peace building, and would argue that without empathy, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to build peace. And empathy doesn't always mean agreeing with someone else, but it is being able to see a different point of view than yours. But we see studies in Northern Ireland, there's a study done of preschool children who by age 3 could recognize difference, by age 4 were stigmatizing that difference. And what worries me in today's world is really the shutting down of public space, and that we think we have it when we're on social media, but in fact you tend to be channeled with people who agree with you. So you're in a bubble where you never have to understand or challenge anyone else's point of view. So I think as peace builders, we need to make sure we're keeping that space available, that we're teaching our children not just the skills of empathy, but the importance of having a system that fosters it.
Thank you. I think these are wonderful and fitting last words of this panel. I would like to thank our panelists and invite you to do so as well.